how would you characterize the current state of affairs in Syria following years of conflict and a recent regime change? And given the complexities of this situation, what would an effective U.S. policy look like in terms of addressing both the immediate challenges and the long-term regional stability?
Well, first, thanks for having me. It is a time of great turmoil, obviously. What has happened in Syria is a true revolution, both internally and in terms of the region, given Syria's regional role over the years. A revolution in the sense that it has swept away all the structures of the former regime, and like any true revolution, it is not exactly clear where it goes next. I think not clear to the outside world, not clear to those in Syria, and probably not even completely clear to those leading this revolution. So it's a time to fasten your seatbelt and not make any prejudgments on what is going to happen. I think it's a time of jubilation, clearly, for many in Syria. A brutal regime is swept away, but it's also a time of concern for many, particularly minority groups like Christians, Alawis, and Kurds. The Assad regime, itself a minority of the Alawi sect, tended to protect other minorities. And with a Sunni majoritarian movement now leading this revolution, I think there are concerns on the parts of those minorities as to what happens. In the region, of course, it is a major setback for Iran and Hezbollah, its client, and it's a setback for Russia. The two main supporters of the Assad regime no longer have a regime to support. That is, in many respects, good news, I think, for regional stability. But it is also, again, a time of uncertainty. We don't know much about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, that is led by Abu Muhammad al-Julani, formerly an al-Qaeda affiliate, that has since publicly split with al-Qaeda. But who are they? Are they a fundamentally, philosophically, and ideologically different organization? Or is it sort of al-Qaeda light? All to be determined. And most fundamentally, I think, there is the question of what happens next. Can those who led the revolution to topple the old regime now consolidate power, which in many respects is a bigger challenge than the overthrow of the regime in the first place? And that remains an open question. What I can say with a fair degree of certainty is what I don't think is going to happen. I don't think you're going to see a rules-based democratic order emerge based on respected institutions anytime soon in Syria. That for over half a century of Assad rule, and for decades before that, there was no emphasis on a legal foundation that protected all its citizens and provided security for all of its citizens, that provided government services, that provided economic opportunity. Syria does not have a history of that, and that lack of a history, I think, sadly dictates that it is not likely to have these attributes of a modern nation that serves its people anytime in the near future. So my expectations and my optimism, let's say, are under control.
It doesn't have both the history or the infrastructure to be able to run a government, a democratic government. But with the new U.S. administration coming in January, what advice would you give to policymakers that are navigating the complex dynamics of Syria and its regional impact?
Well, I think the first thing is to understand that the comments of President-elect Trump that we shouldn't get involved in Syria. We are involved in Syria. We have almost 1,000 troops there, and we are affiliated with one element of the Kurdish political landscape, the Kurdish movement in the northeast, which now faces an uncertain status and future. So the first thing to note is that we are engaged. So what happens there is of direct concern to us. The second point I would make in terms of advice to a new administration is consult closely with partners and allies. We have close relations with all of Syria's neighbors: Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon. They are directly impacted by what happens in Syria, and they are also in a position to influence what happens in Syria for better or for worse. So I would hope that even as we speak, that the lines among our respective capitals are heavily engaged as we seek to gain the assessment of the situation by those closer to it than we are, to determine their positions and their objectives, and then to try to influence that as much as we can for an outcome of some stability and security in Syria that serves the interests of the Syrian people and all of its neighbors. So, again, don't disengage completely, certainly not. But if you don't want to be overly engaged yourself as the United States of America, this is the time to work very closely with partners around the region.
Yeah. Let me ask you further, again, talking about the other players in this conflict, countries like Iran, Turkey. How have both countries' roles in the conflict evolved over the years, and what is their current objective in the region?
It's a great question. I think for Iran, it is now damage control. Iran has suffered a series of strategic setbacks. The virtual annihilation of its ally Hamas in Gaza, the extreme damage done to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now the fall of the only Arab regime with which it was closely aligned with the end of the rule of Bashar al Assad. So I think the Iranians are definitely on their back foot here. That does not mean they are no longer going to be a player, but it does mean that their opportunities for destabilization, at least in the short term, have been much diminished, and that, of course, is a good thing. For Turkey, there is a body of thought out there that holds that the entire HTS campaign was orchestrated in Ankara. I think that is completely untrue. It is true that Turkey has ties to HTS, as it does to other groups in the north, but I think Prime Minister Erdogan's comments have made it clear that that he and his government are not entirely comfortable with the rapid nature of developments in Syria. And again, particularly as a NATO ally, it's very important that we consult closely with the Turks, who have radically different views, for example, on the Kurdish role in Syria than we do, but are also uncomfortable with the rapidity of events, if not their overall trajectory. So, again, it's a time for hope for the Syrian people, but a time for very close consultation with allied nations and partners on what happens next.
Another country that has been uncomfortable with the developments in Syria, as you say, is Israel, which has expressed concerns about a potential Islamist-led government in the country. How do you see Syria's political future impacting Israel's security, especially in the Golan Heights?
Again, it's a great question, and because I think what we've seen, of course, are Israeli moves, both against specific military targets in Syria, but also more significantly to move Israeli forces into the demilitarized zone established in the wake of the 1973 war. I can understand the motivation for such a move, given the uncertainty and instability of the overall situation, but I think Israel has to be very careful that actions that it may intend as purely defensive in nature are not perceived as a new wave of Israeli occupation of Arab lands. And it's maybe helpful to remember in this regard that the name of the leader of HTS, his nom de guerre, is Abu Muhammad el-Jolani, Abu Muhammad the Golani, clearly indicating some affinity or attachment to the Golan region. So I think like all of the players and actors here, Israel has to be very careful and very calculated in the action it takes so that it doesn't inadvertently make a precarious situation even worse.
Now, like you said, President-elect Donald Trump recently talked about how the U.S. should not be involved in Syria, but I know that we know that the U.S. has been interested in countering Iran's influence in that region. What are the risks of underestimating Iran's involvement in the region?
Well, it is important to remember that Iran has suffered a series of setbacks. It is on its back foot in the region because of developments in Gaza as well as in Lebanon and now in Syria. But that does not mean that Iran can now be discounted completely as a factor. They will regroup, rethink, consolidate, and calculate their next moves. And it is important that we keep that in mind as we move ahead. But more immediately, I think there is the threat that brought our troops into Syria in the first place, and that is the reemergence of the Islamic State. That is why we are in Syria, and that is part of a consistent U.S. policy that goes back to 9/11 to ensure that foreign soil is never again used as a base for an attack on the American homeland. And we have seen how tenacious and deep-rooted Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, its predecessor in Syria and Iraq, has been. And it is a sure bet that right now they are looking for ways to take advantage of the turmoil in Syria with the overthrow of the regime to strengthen themselves, to reconsolidate, and to regain ground that they've lost. It is our intention as the United States of America to deny them that opportunity. But we have to keep our focus on the fact that they are there, that they have proved extremely difficult to eradicate, and that they will take advantage of every opportunity they are given, and they are certainly looking at the current situation as providing just those opportunities. And that's, again, why we need to stay engaged and why we need to consult very closely with like-minded partners and allies.
Yeah. Now, Syria has suffered massive destruction and a humanitarian crisis after this decade-long conflict. Let me ask you about something you might, having worked in post-conflict Middle Eastern countries, what would you say are the immediate and long-term needs for reconstruction, and how should they be approached?
Well, the most immediate need is for wide-scale humanitarian assistance. The Syrian economy was already in ruins even before this latest phase of the war, and that revolution has swept away even the wholly inadequate institutions that did exist under the Assad regime. So the first imperative, I think, for the international community is to do everything that we can do to alleviate the suffering of millions of Syrians who have already suffered so much under the brutal Assad regime and the subsequent civil war. The primary vehicle for that assistance is the United Nations, and it deserves our wholehearted support in making available and coordinating humanitarian assistance. Beyond that immediate human need, whatever can be done to stabilize the security situation in Syria is imperative, recognizing that this has to be done from within Syria. It can't be an outside imposed order. That's one thing I think we learned in Iraq. So I think engaging this new emergent movement, HTS, and its allies, identifying who they are, seeking to understand their agenda, and sending the message that international recognition and support will be contingent on how they conduct themselves in these critical early days and weeks of their new order. The public statements from HTS and from its leader have been encouraging, as has his actions in Idlib, the province that HTS has controlled for the last 5 years or so, recognizing minority rights and concerns, engaging with them, particularly the Christian community. That's all good. Now what he has to do, what they have to do, is show that that intent and that rhetoric is going to be matched by their actions on the national level. So again, engaging with this new revolutionary movement, both to understand their intent and to influence their actions at this critical period, I think is an international imperative.
Mm-hmm. Right. Critical period again, talking about the U.S. new administration coming in, the different approaches, obviously. But what lessons can the U.S. learn from its previous involvement in Syria? And how should those lessons inform the future policy? But finally, I guess to add on to that, what do you see as the most likely scenarios for Syria's political and social landscape over the next 5 to 10 years as they're rebuilding or setting up this new government?
Oh my goodness. Well, in a revolutionary environment, an extreme long-range prediction would be the next 5 to 10 weeks, not 5 to 10 years. I think, again, it's important that we keep an eye on the immediate situation. We've talked about humanitarian relief and the need to do everything we can to encourage an international effort to alleviate the widespread suffering of the Syrian people and ensure a safe and orderly return of refugees from outside of Syria. And we need to consult very closely with those more directly involved, those that border Syria, as we've discussed. We have good relations with all of those countries. They all have different perspectives and different agendas. They're all in a position to influence as well as be influenced by what happens in Syria. And we should use our influence and our relations with them to do everything we can to ensure that the outcome leads to stability and security and not the opposite. At the same time, I think we have to be modest in our expectations of what we as the United States can do to influence events. We are not about to reshape a new and glorious future for Syria. That Syrian future is in the hands of the Syrian people, and as we've discussed earlier, it's going to be a very steep uphill climb to build the body of laws and the institutions that guarantee the respect for the rights of all Syrian citizens, their human rights, as well as opportunities for economic growth and future prosperity. These are not conditions that we can impose or wish into being. What we can do is everything that's in our power to alleviate the initial human suffering that is so widespread in Syria as a result of this conflict and the policies of the Assad regime for many years, and to work with close neighbors and allies that border Syria to ensure that we understand their perceptions and perspectives, and that we use what influence we have with them to ensure that whatever role they play in Syria leads to greater stability and security and not the opposite.